To God be the glory.
Hello, welcome back to the study. Now we're in chapter 25. Remember, we just got through talking about Balaam and Balak. Balak was the king of Moab, and Balaam was the prophet that the king was trying to get to curse the children of Israel. But of course, God would not have that. The children of Israel are going to be blessed. Now we're going to see more concerning Balaam. We see the weakness that he had before, and that weakness is going to come out again. Now, when we get to chapter 25, notice the first few verses there. It says, "Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel." Now, in Numbers 31 and verse 16, we find out that this was the counsel of Balaam. The Balaam was actually telling Moab and the Midians to say, hey, you can use your women to tempt the Israelites to engage in idol worship. And it seems to have had its effect. And of course, God is greatly angered by this. In verses 3 through 5, we see Jehovah's answer: kill all of those who join themselves to the worship of Baal of Peor. And verse 6, of course, talks about the Midianites as well being involved in this. Verses 6 through 9, we see a prince in Israel defies himself with a Midianite woman. And from that, Phinehas, here's one with great zeal for God, an Israelite, he kills them in their wickedness. And therefore the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. 24,000 died in that plague. What had taken place that here is Israel committing harlotry with a Midianite woman and bringing her right into the camp. What an affront. What a rejection of God and his will. And so because of that, we see them slain by Phinehas, and we see the plague is stayed. Now in chapter 25, verses 10 through 13, we see a great blessing for Phinehas and his descendants. Look at Psalm 106, starting with verse 28. It says, "They joined themselves also to Baal of Peor, and they ate sacrifices made to the dead. Thus they provoked him to anger with their deeds, and the plague broke out among them. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped, and that was accounted to him for righteousness to all the generations forevermore." It was accounted to him for righteousness because he took action. His great faith moved him to a zealous way to stop this plague by slaying those who had committed such evil before God. And you see that phrase that accounted him to righteousness. We might also consider that same phrase when we're talking about Abraham. If you look at Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6, notice it says, "And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness." And so we see that because of that, it was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. But we have to be careful here, because if we take this verse out of its context, we won't really understand the meaning here. Is this simply faith alone, or is this faith plus works? Well, the Bible actually answers that question for us. If you look at James chapter 2, look at verses 21 through 23. It says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect, and the scripture," the one we're on, Genesis 15:6, "was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." And so the James passage makes it clear that him being accounted for righteousness was not just because of faith only, but faith and works, works of obedience. Faith requires obedience. And so it's important for us to understand that point concerning biblical faith. Faith that pleases God is always an obedient faith. Abraham believed, but it wasn't just simply belief as if it were a mental assent or perhaps some kind of verbal agreement, but it caused him to obey and do those things commanded, faith and obedience. And in this way, it was deemed to be righteousness. It was faith in God that was expressed in the obedience that he did. Had he not obeyed God, well, then his faith would have been a dead faith. It would have been an ineffective faith that we read about in James 2 and verse 26. And so the point made by James is that justification, in other words, being deemed righteous by God, does not come by having faith alone or faith only, but only through an obedient, working faith. Faith that is moved to action to do those things that God has commanded. And so the fact that Genesis 15 and verse 6 was fulfilled when Abraham offered up Isaac on the altar, Genesis 22, we should not think that that means that Abraham was not faithful before that, for certainly he was. Abraham had worshiped God for years. Genesis 12, verse 7, also chapter 13, 3 through 4. So long before the events of Genesis 15, Abraham was a saved, obedient, faithful, righteous worshiper of the Lord. And so the offering of Isaac was simply another demonstration of his obedience that proved his righteousness before God. Abraham demonstrated his obedience from his first interaction with God in Genesis chapter 12. So Abraham left to go to a new land, just as God had commanded him to do. And to say that one is righteous by faith alone, or that one can be saved by faith alone, it puts one on the same level really as the demons. You see, the demons, they believe and they tremble, James 2 and verse 19, but they don't obey. So you're saying that kind of faith saves us? That kind of faith results in righteousness? The faith of the demons? No. Faith has to be mixed with obedience. Faith has to take action. And in that way, we are accounted to be righteous. Now back to our text. If you look at chapter 25, verses 14 through 15, you see a corruption in the leadership. And of course, that's going to corrupt the people. As the leaders go, so go the people. And so you see the example of the leaders is very important to guide the people in the right way. In verse 16 through 18, we see to punish the Midianites. In verse 18, you might notice that word schemes. That's another way of saying tricks that were done. Now, in our outline, chapter 26, we see the second numbering of the people. And so they've had their 40 years of wandering. We've got to number the people again before they go into the promised land. And so in verses 1 through 51 of this chapter, we see the numbering by name. And remember, here's 20 years old or older, those that are able to go to war. We're just talking about the males here. This is not adding in the women and the children. And so the total number is 601,730. And remember, we talked about this just being the men 20 years and older who are able to go to war. If you add in the women and the children, we're still talking about 2.5 to 3 million people that are being led into the promised land. In verses 52 through 56, we see the instructions on the distribution of the land of Canaan, how that is going to take place, that those larger tribes, they're going to receive a larger portion, a larger inheritance. And the smaller tribes, of course, they will receive a smaller inheritance. And so it says, but the land shall be divided by lot. And that's important. It shows that God is in control. God is the one who is deciding who receives what land. And so no one can argue with Moses or Joshua saying this is not fair. No, this is God deciding this, the land that is to be received by each tribe. In verses 57 through 62, we see the numbering of the Levites, and that is 23,000 is the rounded number there. Then verses 63 through 65, we see a summary that none of those of the first rebellion are now alive, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. All else who had taken part of that rebellion, who would not go in to take the land, no, they were all passed away. They have died in the wilderness, and now it's that next generation that will be taken into the promised land. Next in our outline, we see the inheritance of women in chapter 27, verses 1 through 11. So if there is no son, the inheritance is to go to the daughters. And if there's no daughters, then to the nearest kinsman. The point is that it stays in the family. It does not go to another family, another tribe. Next in our outline, we see the appointment of Joshua. And this is chapter 27, verses 12 through 23. Notice chapter 27, starting with verse 12. It says there, "Now the Lord said to Moses, Go up into this Mount Abarim, and see the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you have seen it, you shall also be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother was gathered. For the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my commandment to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin." And so here we see the death of Moses being foretold. He's going to be able to see the promised land, but he's not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. And so we see that instruction there. In verses 15 through 23, we see the consecration of Joshua as Moses' successor. And this is done before all of Israel. They all see this, that they might know that Joshua is God's approved successor. This is the one that God has chosen. And so Eleazar, who is the high priest now, he is to assist Joshua by going to the Lord for guidance, using the Urim and the Thummim, to casting lots to determine God's will in all things. Joshua needs to continue that same practice that Moses was guided how? By God. Moses was following the commands of God. Joshua needs to continue that. Let God be the one with the control who leads them. And here Joshua is simply a go-between, making sure the people do what God has commanded. In chapters 28 through 30, we see the offerings and the vows. At the yearly feast, the congregation had to offer 3 different kinds of sacrifices. You see the daily morning and the evening sacrifices. You see the general sacrifices that were offered on every feast day. And you see the special sacrifices that were peculiar to each holiday. Now in chapter 28 and verse 1, we see that not only are they to follow the pattern of worship, but to do it exactly when they are told. And so it's not just doing what is told, but when it is told. And so that pattern must always be followed by them. Well, what's the lesson for us today? Well, there's a pattern set forth in the New Testament, in the new law, the law of Christ, the pattern that we are to follow concerning our worship and all that we do. And the pattern is there for a reason, because it lays out for us what is to be done and what way it is to be done so that we might be pleasing to God. You see, we have to do it His way, not our way. He is the one who decides what He desires, and so we worship Him according to the pattern. Now in chapter 29 and verse 40, it says, "So Moses told the children of Israel everything just as the Lord had commanded Moses." Now did you see that? How faithful he is. The Lord gives him the commands and he passes it on to the children of Israel so they can know exactly what they are to do. Next, in our outline, chapter 31, we see the war against Midian. So in verses 1 through 12, in the campaign, what we're going to see is that they are going to have to kill all of the males. They kill all five of their kings. They killed Balaam, the son of Beor. And so here we get to see the end result of Balaam. Here was Balaam, the prophet of God, who, remember, the king Balak wanted him to curse Israel, and he would not. God would not allow it. But it seems that Balaam still was trying to gain favor by the king and would actually counsel the Moabites and the Midianites to use their women to entrap Israel. And so here we see the end of that evil prophet, what happens to Balaam. They also took all women and the children captive, and they took all of their goods as plunder, and they burned all of their towns. And so here, this evil nation and all the evil that they had committed, well, the punishment comes. Those that think, well, we can just get away with evil, there'll be no consequences for that. No, the consequences come. God is going to make sure that they are punished for the evil that they have done. In chapter 31, verses 13 through 18, we see the treatment of the prisoners. Now, Moses was angry that the leaders had been sparing the women. And so he said to kill all those who have known a man. Remember, these were the ones who had caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord, to commit that harlotry. And so he says, spare only the virgins and kill all the rest of the males. In verses 19 through 24, we see the purification of the warriors, the prisoners, and the plunders. In other words, the spoils of the victory. In verses 25 through 47, we see the distribution of the spoils of victory, the plunder. And first it was divided between the warriors and the congregation. And then, of course, the Levites received their portion from each half for the Lord's part. The Levites are always taken care of by God. Even though they don't have a land inheritance, God's going to make sure that they are cared for. In verses 48 through 54, we see a special offering of thanks to the Lord from the warriors. Now, in chapter 32, it's very interesting here concerning the settlement east of Jordan. In verses 1 through 5, the two tribes of Reuben and Gad, they had large herds. They saw the land east of Jordan. They're still not in Canaan land proper, but they see that that's a good land. And for all of their livestock, all of their herds, here's these two tribes, the tribes of Reuben and Gad. They say, wow, this is great land. We would rather just stay here rather than actually go into Canaan land, the promised land. We would rather stay here on the east side and inherit this land. Well, in verses 6 through 15, Moses is very angry about this, and he cautions them. He asks, shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? And so Moses reminds them of the unfaithful spies. He warns them against discouraging the rest of Israel by not going into Canaan and fighting for the land. And so in Numbers 32, 16 through 27, we have Reuben and Gad. They promise to help fight for the promised land. But of course, their families and their livestock are going to remain there east of Jordan. And so it seems that perhaps this was a bit of a misunderstanding that Reuben and Gad, yes, they were saying, yeah, we'll go into Canaan land. We'll help fight those battles. We'll win that area for the children of Israel, but we would like to have this side of the Jordan River for our inheritance. We would like to have this as our land. In verse 18, they say, we will not return to our homes until every one of the children of Israel has received his inheritance. And so you see their commitment there to go into the promised land and fight those battles that are going to have to be fought. In verse 23, Moses says, but if you do not do so, then take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. If they change their mind If they say, yeah, we've already got our land here on the east of the Jordan River, we don't need to go fight. We'll just stay here. Well, they will be punished for that. In verses 28 through 32, we see Moses commands Eleazar the high priest, and if they keep their pledge, if they really do go into the promised land and fight like they're supposed to, then he's told, well, give them the land of Gilead. Give them the land of Gilead. But if they don't keep their pledge, what's going to happen? Well, they don't get that land. And make them cross over into Canaan and receive the inheritance with the rest of Israel. And so verses 33 through 36, we see one half of the tribe of Manasseh, and they've also included themselves in this arrangement. And so you actually have 2.5 tribes who settle here on the east of Jordan. And they will fortify those cities, and that will become their inheritance. Next in our outline, we see the wilderness encampments, chapter 33, verses 1 through 49. And in that, you see that there are the journeys of the children of Israel. And then you see the allotment of the land, chapter 33, verse 50 through chapter 34. Verses 50 through 56, notice that God commands Israel to eliminate the Canaanites and to divide their land for their inheritance. And in verse 55, there's a warning here. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes, thorns in your side, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. And so they have a warning concerning this. And if they would but had listened to that warning, because as the children of Israel go into the promised land to defeat those evil tribes and completely wipe them out, they don't do it. They leave some. They leave that remaining part that is indeed an irritant to them, irritant to their eyes, and a thorn in their side, and harasses them all their days because they did not clear out the land as they had been commanded to do. And so we see they were warned. They were warned about this. In chapter 33, verse 56, it says, moreover, it shall be that I will do to you as I thought to do to them. In other words, you're not going to be pleasing to God if you don't drive these people out. In chapter 34, verses 1 through 15, it says the borders of the land of Canaan. However, of course, we know the 2.5 tribes have their land on the east of the Jordan. But here you have the borders of the land of Canaan. In verses 16 through 29, you have the list of the men who are appointed to distribute the land. Of course, a process that has to take place to do this correctly. And then in chapter 35, here in our outline, we see this is the cities of refuge. And so these, verses 1 through 8, were towns for the Levites that were set aside. And there would be 48 cities in all, 42 regular cities and 6 cities of refuge to make a total of 48 cities. Each tribe is to give from their land the Levites cities. Remember, the Levites, they don't have a land inheritance, but they have these cities. And so in verses 4 through 5, we see to limit the extent, 1,000 cubits from the wall of the city, and the outer border to be 2,000 cubits plus the size of the city. So in chapter 35, verses 9 through 34, we have a selection and an appointment of the cities of refuge. Their number, the cities of refuge, there will be 6, and these shall be cities of refuge for you, we are told in verse 12. Well, for what? Well, from the avenger, the near kinsman, and that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. And so here, if a death takes place, let's say you unwittingly kill one, you can flee to the city of refuge, and you can have your trial brought before the court, and here the avenger, some near relative, cannot come and slay you. here in the city of refuge. In chapter 15, these 6 cities shall be for the refuge for the children of Israel, for the stranger, for the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills a person accidentally may flee to these cities. And so these are appointed for the people. In verses 16 through 21, you see the description of a murderer, what's being talked about for these cities of refuge. And in verse 19, you have the avenger of blood himself, that he shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. He shall put him to death. So that's why it was so important that you flee to one of these cities so that you can have your court case brought before to be tried. Verses 22 through 28, we see the treatment of the innocent manslayer. He was to remain in the city of refuge, and after that he has been judged innocent, and he is to remain there until the current high priest dies. And so he can stay in that city and he can live in safety. And then after the high priest dies, he can return to his home, and the avenger of blood is not allowed to kill him. But if he goes outside the limits of the city, well, the avenger of blood can kill him for that, and the avenger of blood shall be held innocent for doing that. Verses 29 through 34, we see additional regulations on the cities of refuge. In verse 30, we see 2 witnesses are required for the death penalty. We see this many times talked about in Scriptures, the witnesses that are required. In verse 31, we see no ransom for the convicted murderer. He was to be put to death. That was the penalty for his crime. Also, verse 32, no ransom for the innocent manslayer. He must remain in the city of refuge until either he dies or the current high priest dies. In verse 33, so you shall not pollute the land where you are. For blood defiles the land, it says. For the blood that is shed on it, except for by the blood of him who shed it. And so there you see the information concerning that. Now you might wonder about the capital punishment of our day. Look at Romans chapter 13. See the new law and what it teaches. It says in chapter 13, starting with verse 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Notice it goes on. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. And so you see, even under the new law, the law of Christ, the government is there for that purpose, to make sure that order is kept. And he does not bear the sword in vain. Certainly a reference to capital punishment that comes upon those who are guilty of such and deserving of such. In chapter 36, we see the tribal inheritance taking place. And of course, the children of Israel, verses 1 through 4, you have of them the children of Manasseh. They asked Moses to rule on the unmarried female heirs, marrying outside their own tribe. Well, will the land be ceded to the other tribe into which they were married? Well, it's going to stay within the tribe and not go to another. In verse 5, we see the ruling of God. They shall marry only within their own tribe. In verse 9, thus no inheritance is going to change hands from one tribe to another, but every tribe of the children of Israel shall keep its own inheritance. Notice as it closes this book, in verse 13, it says, these are the commandments and the judgments which the Lord commanded the children of Israel by the hand of Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from Jericho. And so that concludes our study of the book of Numbers. Next time, we will go into the book of Deuteronomy. The study will continue in this way. Be sure and read ahead. It's very important that you read the text so you can know and understand the information that we are conveying in the lesson. Thank you so much for your attention. The lesson is yours.